Hey, good morning, everybody. If you would take your seats, and we'll go ahead and get started. We've got a good bit to cover this morning, but not quite as much as last week. I did try to fit too much in, and the feedback from Amy was that you were talking pretty fast. So, but thankfully, she said I didn't slur my words, so we'll take that as a win. But I will try to slow down my words this morning. Let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for this new day, this Lord's Day, where we can come and gather as your people to worship you freely. We thank you for this opportunity we have to discuss the news and hopefully some things that will help us to do that better, help us to submit every area of our lives to you. And we pray that you would give us wisdom and guide our conversation this morning. And we pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Pilgrims in this wired world. So I wanted to start by recapping a bit what we talked about last week. The first thing we talked about last week was the goal. I said it several times. So does anybody remember the goal? It was the main point of last week. What I said was our goal. Anybody want to? That's right. Thank you, Jeff. Use a gospel lens when we're consuming news. So that was sort of the main overarching idea. Then we talked about some of the common media messages that we hear, and this really applies to both the right and the left, regardless of what media you're consuming, whether it's print, TV, whatever. There are these common media messages that we oftentimes hear. So does anybody? We'll do this like Family Feud style. Anybody remember what those common media messages were? 1, 2. I'll just recap them real quick. And then we'll recap the 7 warnings. Now I will ask for audience participation on that one. But the common media messages were the preeminence of power. Again, whether you turn on MSNBC or Fox, when we consume news, it tends to be just the overriding message is that power, and specifically U.S. political power, is the most important thing that we should be paying attention to. It's also talked about wealth. Money is people who have money are important, and that's an emphasis. We also talked about the emphasis on earthly weapons, just in terms of our communication, the fear and anxiety that is often just part of the. It's like a feature, not a bug, of a lot of media. Trying to get us stirred up so that we will come back and so that we will share those stories on social media and so on. And then the idea that materialism runs through. We talked about how Ephesians 6 says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, and yet when we turn on the news, that's basically all it's focused on. There's usually not even an acknowledgement of the spiritual that we know is much more important. So the 7 warnings, let's talk about those. Who remembers what the 7 warnings were? All right, Andrew? Our own biases, that's right. That's number 1. Our beware of our own biases. What else?
Echo chambers?
There you go, yeah. Beware of echo chambers. So we got number 1 and number 7. What else?
Anonymous sources.
Beware of anonymous sources. There we go. There's one. What was it? Yes, beware of algorithms. Yes. What else? We got 4. That's pretty good. There's 3 more.
Only the headlines.
There we go. Man, Andrew was taking notes. Reading only headlines. Anybody else? 2 more. Matt, you had a question about one, so I know you remember one of them. We're about to talk about it.
Recognizing bias or worldview.
Well, recognizing, I said beware of ideological outlets, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But you said, well, how do we recognize those? So that was one of them. And then James, did you have number 7?
Was that the Darwinism?
That was one of the common media messages. Yeah. We definitely did talk about that. The other one was beware of business incentives. So that applies to mainstream media, kind of traditional media, but also especially, I think, to non-traditional media. For going on to something like YouTube, they have an incentive to keep you coming back and getting clicks and saying things that will be provocative. Two quick clarifications I did want to make from last week. One was afterward, I got some helpful feedback and a few questions, one of which made me think I should probably clarify something. I am not at all one of those people who thinks we should disengage, so I hope nothing I said led you to believe that we should disengage from the culture. What I was, I vote in every election. I'm working to revitalize journalism. I believe we should absolutely engage in all areas of society. The problem is when we let all those other areas inform our theology rather than the other way around. So that's really what I was saying. We should bring God's word to bear more on our engagement. This week, I'm listening to Nancy Pearcey's book, Total Truth, which it's like 20 years old. It's not new, but it's good. And she made wrote in there a quote that I really like. If Christianity really is true, then it will yield better results in every discipline. And obviously, she has a lot to say about that, but I absolutely believe that's true. In whatever our spheres are, we should bring the Bible to bear. Okay, so I want to get to Matt's question because I think this is a really important one. How do we identify an ideological outlet? And I did a bit of crowdsourcing on this week. As I mentioned in the introduction last week, I used to work at World Magazine, and so there's a few of us who stay connected via Slack, a Slack group. So I put this out to them. I was like, what would you say? What are some of the hallmarks of ideological outlets that people should be aware of? And so right off the bat, Susan Olasky said, sensational over-the-top language. So that's one. And I think a lot of these actually do relate to language in some form. Someone else said, a clear, consistent enemy. Is it always, very simple? You've got good versus evil, and there's no nuance. And I'll talk about. I'm going to show you an example of that here in just a minute. Only presents one side of the story, which is similar to that previous one. Always confirms what you already thought, rarely challenging what you think, your preconceived notions. Source disparity, using sources that for one side sound educated and for one side sound uneducated. In the business, we call this nut picking, choosing crazy people to speak for one side as opposed to the other side. And I have an example of this. I'll just mention briefly. I believe it was 2015, when the Supreme Court was hearing the challenge to DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. There were two competing. I was covering this for World, and there were two competing demonstrations that met on First Street, right between the Capitol and the Supreme Court. And reading the Washington Post, you would think that there was only one demonstration that took place, and they quoted. I actually counted up at the time. I believe they quoted 11 pro same-sex marriage sources, and the one traditional marriage source that they quoted was from the Westboro Baptist Church people over there protesting, just to make them sound as extreme as possible. So that's nut picking. There were thousands of people there, a very diverse group. I mean, all sorts of. It wasn't just your kind of traditional, white conservative evangelicals over here. I mean, it was a very diverse group that were there to advocate for traditional marriage, including a Democratic lawmaker from up in New York who had bussed down people. He's from Puerto Rico, I want to say. But anyway, it was just super interesting. There was so much more interesting stuff to report on there, but the Washington Post wasn't very curious about any of that. So, and then Marvin Olasky, and for those who don't know, I'm going to be talking about Marvin a couple times today, and so he responded to your question, Matt, so I'm about to talk about that. But if you're not familiar with Marvin, I worked with him for 8 years at World, but he's more known, even though he was at World for 30 years, he was more known for some stuff that happened back in the 90s. He wrote a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, which became a big thing in Republican circles back in the 90s when Newt Gingrich took over as speaker in 1994. He had all the freshmen read this book, The Tragedy of American Compassion, and then that was some of the principles that Marvin espoused became part of welfare reform in 1996, and then eventually became compassionate conservatism, which is what George W. Bush ran on in 2000. Anyways, so that's who Marvin is. He's also written a number of books on Christian journalism, journalism in general, but Christian journalism too. So on the back of your handout, there's actually 2 books that you'll note are from Marvin. Reforming Journalism is probably the one that's most relevant to the stuff I'll be talking about today. The one, Prodigal Press, is more about anti-Christian bias in the mainstream media. So recommend both of those. So anyways, Marvin said in response to this question, he said, number 1 is the sky is falling, last election ever rhetoric is common with ideological outlets. Also, you must vote for X or you're not a Christian or not a humanitarian. And then he also said outlets that tend to stay high on the ladder of abstraction. And that's a term he uses to talk about sort of just talking in the abstract in big sweeping terms about sides and ideas as opposed to going down to street level about, what are the actual, what are people experiencing on the street? The real, because, particularly with public policy, it's nuanced. There's trade-offs, there's unintended consequences, there's all sorts of things. It's complex. And so you need outlets that are really in the weeds on those. So, sorry, I'm getting behind on our... Sorry. This is something else that I wanted to talk about here with, in terms of ways to understand ideological outlets. We tend to think just only on the left versus right continuum, and there's another one, and this is really what we're talking about right now with the ideological outlets. There's another one that we should be thinking about, which is journalism versus activism. I could have plotted a whole bunch, but I didn't want to distract you. There's probably differences of opinion about where exactly you would plot people. That's not really the point. It's just to sort of give you an idea of what this kind of thinking, this framework, can help you to do. So, most of the mainstream media lives up here. Left of center. Various degrees of journalistic excellence and principles, but most are going to be center-left. You've got a lot of outlets down here in the more the activism category. I think Progress actually is no longer publishing, but the Huffington Post, you're probably familiar with that. Yes, Randy?
Where would you put the Washington Post on that?
So, definitely up here in this quadrant. Exactly where would be up for discussion. I used to have a subscription to the Washington Post, and in the Jeff Bezos era, I feel like they've gone down a path of clickbait and further left than they were before. So I really don't hardly ever read the Washington Post. Yeah, James.
Just want a point of clarity. It's a good point to bring up that when you're looking at activist publications, especially profit-driven ones, that's really the direction, especially a lot of conservatives as well. But I think a lot of that mistrust, you didn't really touch on this, and I'd like your thoughts on it. A lot of the mistrust came, especially in the COVID era, and we have a tendency to kind of blame that on the profit incentive really taking hold at that time. But I think a lot of it was mistrust with some of the
Right.
more journalistic,
Right.
higher hoity-toity ones that proved to be really untrustworthy in that.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. I'm going to come back to that because there's one of the recommendations because that also relates to something that Matt Ragsdale talked about last week that I wanted to circle back to in terms of what's identified as misinformation and the holes in some coverage. So I'll circle back to that. Really, my point on this right here is just to say that a lot of times the response to the leftward lean of the mainstream media in conservative circles is to be down here. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second with Breitbart. But, I'm trying to think of the easiest way to explain this. There are outlets that are covering things from a center-left perspective, but are still doing original reporting and news gathering. Whereas a lot of times, you remember, like last week, for example, we talked about the Daily Wire example where they had taken the Chicago Tribune, I think it was, they'd taken their story and, basically just sort of gave it a rightward spin without any new reporting. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. That's the difference between this space and this space. There are a whole lot of outlets down here. I would actually argue that these are like the only two I can think of up here. There really are not many who are doing original reporting, fact-based original reporting from a center-right perspective. It's really hard to find. So I think the Wall Street Journal is one of them. I'm sure people have a lot of various opinions about the Dispatch in terms of their opinion pieces, but I'm mainly talking about news reporting. When you read how they present the news, it's generally very, very straightforward. So I pulled up one other thing that Marvin said was to come down the ladder of abstraction myself with you all, which was to give you some specific examples of ideological outlets. And he named 4, the Epoch Times, China Today, Russia Today, and Al Jazeera. So those are 4 he named. I also picked up 4 yesterday. I just went to, at random, I went to these websites. This is not nut picking. This is what these websites were showing yesterday. So Mother Jones is an example on the left. You can see right here we have, Newt Gingrich perfectly describes how everything is his fault. So Republican is evil. Jared Kushner's ambition threatens one of Europe's latest pristine ecosystems. Republican is evil, and then Elizabeth Warren is the hero down here. So, you can, with an ideological outlet, you'll just see that kind of common thread. Everything fits into the narrative. Then I went to Breitbart and got an example here. This illustrates several things in the warning signs I was just talking about. The clear, consistent enemy. We have a couple here. We have, Mike Johnson is a clear, consistent enemy. We have up here Bidenomics bust. I don't think you need to know, where are they coming from in their coverage of economics? It's pretty clear right off the bat. But then the other thing, the over-the-top language and what Marvin said about the sky is falling, last election rhetoric. We have World War III watch. Mike Johnson's betrayal puts America on collision course with nuclear power adversaries. And you might think, if you didn't know anything about this, you might think, did he revoke his citizenship and he's been selling state secrets to Russia or something? This sounds like a big deal. It was actually a funding vote. So Breitbart disagreed with a funding vote, and it's the end of the world. So, and if you're not familiar with Breitbart, you might be thinking, this is not, you may think this is fringe or not common, but this is actually, I looked it up yesterday, according to SEMrush, which is an industry leader, Breitbart is actually the 73rd most visited website in America. Millions and millions of people lap this up every day. So I think that's, it is what it is, but it's important to recognize that. Well, thank you for mentioning the t-shirt. One thing I also wanted to mention about ideological outlets oftentimes have a strong financial incentive structure. And it might look like fundraising or hawking their stuff or whatever, but you'll really get a heavy sense of they want me to buy something or spend money. So up here, donate on Mother Jones, that's prominently displayed. And then with Breitbart, obviously if World War III is upon us and, nuclear war, you need a prayer t-shirt. So, so we're hawking goods here. And if you scroll down, there's more examples of that on their page. So let me just pause there. There have been a couple questions already, but did that make sense? Yeah, Dave?
It makes sense, and it's also striking too. Look at the font size and the colors that are used.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Daily Mail, New York Post, Breitbart, other types that will flag up like the whole. It's almost this heuristic of if they use adverbs, adjectives, and color in the headline or in the first paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Probably less on the news side than it is on the let's get you excited.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yes.
How would you categorize? There's like another, the newer small online, like the pour over, or some of those sources.
So I mentioned this last week. I'm not familiar with that one, and I mentioned this last week that a lot of people will I get that question often, is like asking about specific outlets. There's a lot I'm not familiar with, so mainly what I'm trying to do is give specific, sort of like a framework for whatever outlet you're approaching. I will say that I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but one thing that one thing I appreciate and I think is more helpful are aggregators that can kind of do some sifting for me, as opposed to me going to a specific place where I'm going to get all the facts, sort of getting a broad view of what's going on and various perspectives. Let me just, I want to move on quickly, because we're already starting to run short on time. So there are typically, in churches, when I have conversations with people about this, there are generally 3 different types of people that I meet. One would be the addict. These are folks who, and I please don't take offense at the term. It was just the best thing I could think of to describe it. But the talk radio is running all the time in the background. Maybe cable news is running all the time at home. When you're in your car, you're listening to podcasts, and it's just, you've got a constant flow of information. It's like surround sound. And I will be honest, this was me in my 20s. I was in sales. I was on the road a lot. I drove like 5,000 miles a month, and I listened to Sean Hannity for 3 hours every afternoon. It's just what I did. And so I think this is common. But then you also have the ignorer. The folks who are like, I don't know. I don't want to hear about it. I'm just, I'm too busy. I'm not going to pay attention to any news at all. And then there's the informed, which I guess gives away, like, which one do you want to be? So this is what I think is the goal. Should be, I think it's really important to think about the fact that there aren't. It's not like we have a biblical admonition to keep up with the news. So this really is an area where Christian wisdom comes into play. So I think that's important on the one hand to acknowledge, but I do think, obviously, with the work I'm in, I believe it's important to keep up with the news and stay informed. One of my favorite journalism quotes is from Karl Barth, who said, "We must hold the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other." And as I said, we just need to make sure our Bible is informing the one and not the other way around. We need to make sure that we have those correct. But I think what we need is what I call a heavenly detachment when consuming news. And this was written about some on the back of your handout is another book. You may or may not have heard of it, but in 2021, there was a book published called Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news by Jeffrey Bilbrough. And he wrote this: "When the news sets itself up as the light of the world, it is usurping the role that rightly belongs only to the word proclaimed in the Bible. But when the news helps us attend together to the ongoing work of this word, it plays a vital role in enabling us to love our neighbors." So I thought that was a good way of kind of approaching the news and thinking about what it can do for us as believers. So 7 recommendations. The first is to pray before you consume. I think we should ask ourselves and pray, is what I'm about to watch or read make me angry, make me anxious, lead me into sin, And if that's possible, I think we should ask, is it necessary? Do I need this? Does it align with Philippians 4:8? Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And I think in line with the quote from Reading the Times is to think about what Jesus said is the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Are my news habits contributing to that mission? Number 2 is to measure and limit your news consumption. I encourage people to journal your news consumption for a week or two and just write down every time I'm reading or listening or watching the news, and see what does that look like, just being aware of that. But then also along the same time, track everything that you consume that is some type of spiritual food, whether it's listening to a sermon podcast, obviously being at church on Sundays, going to Bible study, any of those types of things, and just kind of weigh, which of these is which of these inputs is receiving more information? And then ask yourself some questions. Was this the best use of my time? Was I able to be a better spouse, parent, worker, neighbor, etc.? And then who or what is shaping my mind? Am I allowing these sort of external forces to flood out what I may be hearing at church or in my Bible study or whatever? Now, some will say, I need to keep up with the news to be able to engage on current events with my neighbor about what's happening. And I think there's an element of truth to this, but I also think we need to ask ourselves, is that really what we're doing? And is that really necessary? Last week we talked about Luke 13 and the way that Jesus handled what was a current event when someone came to him and asked him about Pilate mixing the blood of murdered Jews with his pagan sacrifices, what was a horrific thing. And Jesus didn't engage on the merits of how terrible this was or how bad the Romans were or, nothing about power or politics, but he responded with a gospel-centered response, which was, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, do you think that they were any worse than you? Unless you too turn and repent, you'll suffer the same result, consequence. And so, when I think about this, it's like, what would that look like if you're engaging with your neighbor and they come to you with, and they want to talk about the latest Biden gaffe or the latest crazy thing, President Trump said on social media or something, what would it look like to apply that principle? And I think of, a response like, that's a good reminder of the fleeting limits of power. I'm glad our hope is not in politics. Just sort of turning the nature of the conversation away from the crazy thing rather than getting in the gutter and, I can't believe we have these terrible choices again, and the things that we all often talk about. And I think it could be an opportunity. It could be a gospel opportunity if you're talking to a non-believer to understand sort of, why are you not all torn up about the election? And you can turn the conversation that way. But then also, if you're talking to a fellow believer, hopefully it would be an encouragement to them to, let's not get overly concerned about the things that are passing away, and stay focused on what's really important. And to that end, let me just say, it is an election year. We're about 6 months out from a presidential election, but obviously there were many other elections going on. And, I think in terms of this limit news consumption, I think I would just ask myself, I'm just going to go out on a limb. I will not ask for show of hands, but I'm guessing 95% of the people in this room already know how you plan to vote in November. So I think asking yourself, how much time do I need to be spending keeping up with every bit of the horse race between now and then, I think we should ask ourselves, is this really what we should be doing? Okay, so on to use a biblical framework for news. And if you don't catch anything else I say today, I hope you'll really dial in on this one, because I think this is really a helpful framework that can help us apply what I've put out as the goal, which is using a gospel lens for news consumption. So, I won't go back over Luke 13, but we just talked about that. But Ephesians 6 says we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but yet media focuses almost exclusively on the flesh and blood realities. And again, I know I talked about it last week. I'm going to talk about it again. I thought Pastor Borger's sermon from 2 weeks ago was outstanding. And two of the quotes that I wrote down that I think are relevant here are, he said, "Are you setting your mind on the spirit or on the flesh?" And then he also said, to set the mind on the flesh is death. So again, I think we just need to be constantly asking ourselves what's flowing into our minds. In terms of how we approach news, Marvin Olasky, again, has written extensively on this, and I like this quote on what he calls biblical objectivity and what it is. It says, he said, biblical objectivity is based on the understanding that God is holy, we are sinners, and Christ's sacrifice bridges the gap. The heavens declare the glory of God, but the streets declare the sinfulness of man. Biblical journalism emphasizes God's holiness and man's sinfulness. Instead of practicing objectivity in the traditional sense, which balances subjective views of things that may be ungodly, biblical objectivity is the God's eye view of things. Given our human limitations, along with our fallenness and sinfulness, we can never achieve that perspective. But by following the Bible's teachings, we try to come as close as we can. So again, we're not all going to agree about where a particular issue lands in terms of the level of biblical clarity that we have on some issues, but it does help provide us with a helpful framework. So this is something that we used at World to sort of determine to what extent would we kind of allow our biblical perspective to come through versus something where the Bible is silent. And so if you've ever been whitewater rafting, there's a classification system for, a level 1 or class 1 is a very smooth thing. Anybody can do it, and then it gets progressively harder, where 6 is something that is, you could die. You've got to be a skilled person to navigate a river that would have class 6 rapids. So that's the idea behind this. A class 1 rapids is something where the Bible takes an explicit position. We will also, and again, this is written from a world perspective. Obviously, this World News Group, World Magazine, it's going to play itself out differently if you are like, I'm practicing journalism in a secular context right now, so that's obviously different when your audience is assumed, probably unbelievers, as opposed to World, where most all of their readers, viewers, listeners are believers. So class 1, where the Bible takes an explicit position, we will as well. Examples would be adultery and homosexuality. Class 2, where the Bible takes an implicit position. Example would be the importance of Bible-centered education. Class 3, this is where partisans on both sides can quote scripture verses, but careful study leads to biblical conclusions. Example would be welfare reform. And when we say welfare reform, he's essentially talking about that you should work for aid that you get. I mean, that was kind of the idea behind welfare reform, if you're not familiar with that issue. Class 4, no clear biblical path, but we can bring to bear significant historical experience and a biblical understanding of human nature. Class 5, no clear historical trail, but a Bible-based understanding of human nature gives us some clues. Class 6, you're on your own, trade agreements. He talks about how back, I don't know, it was the late 70s, I think in the lead up to the 1980 election, there were Christian voter guides that were put out, and along with these issues that do have some biblical clarity, there was the Christian position on control of the Panama Canal. And Marvin was like, that's not, I mean, that does not, I think a lot of times we take issues that may be clear, that are higher on the rapids, and then we sort of bring our own biases to bear, and we think, yeah, this whole slate of issues works together, and sometimes we need to separate those out, Another one I would mention would be something like the Second Amendment. There are different views in this room about, what that should look like in practice. And that's okay. The Bible does not have, the level of clarity we might like. Now, the Constitution does. And, as Marvin always said, we respect the Constitution, but it's not infallible, So it's just a different type of analysis that we would use for issues that don't have biblical clarity. So one thing I'll add that Marvin said that I didn't want to say earlier because it wouldn't have made sense till you saw this, but he said another sign of an ideological outlet would be using our lingo. He said treating a class 3 as a class 1 or a class 6. So in other words, if you've got a class 3 where it's not totally clear biblically, you've got to allow for some disagreement. But if they're treating it like, oh, everybody knows how you should handle this, then that's not, they have their ideological biases coming out. Same thing down here. If I mentioned the Panama Canal, that would be an example of that. It's a class 6, and yet, there are some people who were treating it like a class 1, which is not, right.
So here you have the Bible as the controlling measure.
Mm-hmm.
In a secular context, what is the equivalent that he said in this?
He said in a secular context, what would be the equivalent of something like this? I mean, there really isn't one. I mean, it's not in a secular context. It's untethered from anything, as far as I can tell. It's basically your political biases. Where those will end up coming out in an outlet. So yes.
There's this thing called natural law that's a whole big subject, right? But Protestant most people will agree on just by conscience.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's relevant or not.
No, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. For those who couldn't hear, he was saying that there's a rich tradition of understanding of natural law, and yet today we've kind of lost sight of that.
Catholics are generally good at it, but
Yes.
Protestants,
Catholics are good at it. Protestants generally aren't. But it's the understanding that, I know Marvin talks a lot about common grace. The idea that even unbelievers can see truth and report it in terms of the news, because all truth is God's truth. Yes.
and what's happened is because we see Christian thought as antithetical to non-Christian thought, we don't see the there's also this shared discord, and so it's like a no holds barred kind of approach rather than a consensus approach to
Mm-hmm.
Muslims, Catholics, and conservative Protestants have more in common with, say, liberal Protestants
And Jews.
and
Yeah,
Jews.
yeah.
Well, depending on what which kind of Jewish person.
Right.
Yeah, but because it's no holds barred, mutually assured destruction when it comes to political discourse, the art of the compromise is lost, and so.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, James.
You touched on this on an earlier slide, I want to make sure I get it right, but in line with what he's talking about, now in even the more objective publications, things that we would consider a class one, they put way down in 4 or 5, if we're using
Right.
this
Mm-hmm.
metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
and to where things that would have been commonly understood through a natural law
Yeah.
perspective are now, they take totally neutral positions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we look at them and we say, that's a radical take, and they're like, no, it's a moderate take.
Right.
In the grand scheme of things, where things have gone now, yes, it is. These things that we would consider in that class 1 to 2
Mm-hmm.
are totally
Right.
related to, they're morally neutral now.
Right, right. Yeah, James was just saying that there are things that were used to have common understanding and agreement on that are now morally neutral because of moral relativism. It's sort of like, oh, we don't know what the right position is on this when, biblically there is a clear answer. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, just real quick. So two examples of that, sanctity of life and that there's only 2 genders.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
given what came out this week at the former NPR editor,
Mm-hmm.
their
Mm-hmm.
bent, their sort of neutral starting point was way to the left.
Right.
Because they had all these assumptions that were left as progressive, that
Right.
pick the subject in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
That was their starting point.
Right.
So the whole, whatever would have been a Christian cosmology to try and filter and or start from to present whatever the subject was,
Mm-hmm.
there's a whole separate cosmology that's been substituted for whatever the Christian cosmology
Right.
is.
Yeah.
That's a whole different universe.
And I think what he illustrated, one of the most powerful points in the piece by the NPR guy, that it's on your handout. If you haven't seen it, there's a link on the back. But it was about a week and a half ago. There was an NPR editor who'd been there for like 25 years who talked about their bias. And I think one of the most powerful points there was that he looked it up, and every single employee I guess it was. I mean, there's more than 87 employees at NPR, but I guess it was just in maybe his DC bureau or whatever, was a registered Democrat. And so he was just explaining the way that led to holes in their coverage. They failed to be curious where they should have been, And so I think, they can, you can think you're being fair, but if you're in an echo chamber, then you don't even realize that where your biases are. You just have huge blind spots. And so that's why I think, newsroom diversity is really, really important, so we can see those. Okay, I want to move on to the next one, which is consider the source. Is this outlet credible? I'm just going to give you some questions that I'd like to just get you thinking. Is this outlet credible? Real journalism is original reporting of fact-based stories. So original reporting means you are talking to person X and quoting them in a story. You're not only saying, well, they said in this interview and they said in this, and you're piecing things together or just criticizing what they're saying elsewhere. It's journalism is news gathering. That's the process. And so original reporting is important in terms of establishing it doesn't mean every single story is originally reported, but they should regularly be doing original reporting at a legitimate outlet. Who is behind it? This has become a bigger and bigger issue as There are, I don't know if you've heard of the term pink slime websites, but basically these websites that come out and sort of act like they're covering things legitimately, but they're really being funded by people with a partisan agenda, and these exist on both the right and the left. If you don't know who's funding an outlet, then that's a red flag you should be aware of. What are their motivations? Do they use original sourcing, as I talked about just a moment ago? Do they go to the places they're reporting? Is this some guy in his garage just sounding off on big issues, editing videos together, or is this someone who's actually talking to the sources that he or she is covering? And I mentioned this last week. Do they issue corrections? I mean, any legitimate news organization will issue corrections. And he's not here this morning, but Reeves Valentine texted me this morning, and he was reading something in The Economist, and he's like, "Look, it's a correction. It's a legitimate news source, So that's what they do. But if you notice that is missing, then I would be very cautious about an outlet. Okay, the next one, and I let me rush to say, as Paul does in 1 Corinthians, this is I, not the Lord. I'm not trying to make a mandatory thing out of this, but I think there's wisdom in this, and it is to turn off cable news. And in fact, really, I'm kind of saying TV news in general. Let me explain. I think news was never intended to be entertainment, and yet that's what it's become. If you watch an old, I don't know, you could Walter Cronkite or something. I mean, they literally sat at a desk and read you the news. It was supposed to be boring, devoid of bias and anger and all the stuff, but it's harder to get people to watch that way, and so they have turned it into this giant production. And I want to read you just some quotes. Walter Cronkite himself, back in the day, said, quote, "Television is not an adequate medium to adequately inform the public on complicated issues." Francis Schaeffer, also, if you've ever seen, there's a video series that he did back in the 70s, and he talked about, you can look it up on YouTube, it's pretty easy to find. I don't think I put that on your handout, but anyways, he just talks about the importance of a viewpoint. A camera can be, zoomed in on this, and another camera zoomed in on this, and then you underlay it with a different narrative from the host, and you get two completely different stories out of the same event. And this was a staged event that they did with this group of either young people or hoodlums, just depending on which story you were reading, clashing with police. And so it just illustrated the way that we tend to see something as, oh, that happened because we saw it with our own eyes on TV, but that's not always the case. He warned that TV can be very manipulative, and he called it, he said, what we really should recognize is that we're viewing an edited symbol of what actually occurred, but, quote, "the nature of TV is such that we see it with our own eyes and naturally look at it as though it were objective truth." So we just need to be aware of, again, the way we consume information. I also wanted to read, Marty Saltz is not here this week, but I did ask her about this. She was a former local television anchor, and she had a lot to say about it. She got going, but she sent me an email and just said, to kind of explain some of what she was talking about, thought it would be helpful to read to you. She said, "This is language that News Consulted directed us to use in promotional teases as well as copy in the newscasts. These are words and phrases that had been tested to resonate with audiences. It's not a concept any different from specific language used in advertising, but people don't realize that the same strategies are employed by their favorite news organizations, which they may deem to be truth tellers." So some of the statements she wrote out were, breaking news, late breaking, we've just checked, we're working the phones, we just checked our sources, we have new information since our last report. These are specific words that they're using to get you to keep watching. And, she felt like, it's essentially manipulative. On this last one, she included the note, this wouldn't be a lie, but the new information might be the address of a suspect or something. It doesn't mean it's majorly changing the story. It's just a way to get you to keep watching. So then, lastly, I reached out to a friend of mine, because, that's on talking about local news specifically, but I also reached out to a guy named Cal Thomas. If you're familiar with him, he's been syndicated columnist for many years and was involved with the Moral Majority back in the 80s and all sorts of interesting stuff. But he was a Fox News contributor for a number of years, and I asked him, to just give me his thoughts on cable TV news and particularly paid contributors, since he was one. He said that he had never been told what to say or not to say, but he said he certainly is aware of people who have said that they are. But he said, I'm just going to read this to you. He said, too many paid contributors to cable and network news have little experience in politics. Some are called Republican or Democratic strategists, in quotation marks. The only thing they have strategized seems to be how blonde to dye their hair and which short skirt and high heels to wear on set. There is a revolving door between TV and political or party activism. People now mostly tune in to those networks that reinforce what they already believe. With the credibility of the press at the all-time lows, you might think the networks would have on people with more knowledge instead of those who basically repeat talking points from their party's point of view. The current controversy, this was in March, so it's a few weeks old now, but the current controversy is over NBC's hiring and firing of former RNC chair Ronna McDaniel. Much has come from the hard-left MSNBC, a network that employs Jen Psaki, the former White House press secretary. Fox does the same thing with two former Trump spokespeople, Dana Perino and Kayleigh McEnany. Cable networks need to keep their audiences and feed them what they want. This is not journalism. A small percentage of what you see are real journalists and real journalism. So I won't say any more about that. I would just encourage you to think about it. Maybe getting news another way would be good. And I'll talk more about that here in just a minute. On this next point, which is consume widely. So when I say consume widely, obviously, I think you have enough context about my perspective on all of this to know that I'm not saying consume a lot. I'm not, way deeply. I'm saying consume widely. Don't get into a narrow view of the news and what's coming from it. So this is where I did want to circle back to, Matt Ragsdale pointed out last week that, what is deemed misinformation can sometimes keep us from getting news that is actually legitimate news. And in the NPR piece that the editor wrote, he talked about how, some specific examples of that, and he talked about, I'm going from memory, but, COVID origins was certainly one of them. For a long time it was treated as misinformation that it could have come from the lab, and it just came from the wet market or whatever they call it. And, eventually it came out that was actually, there was, at a minimum, they didn't know for sure, but there was actually modest, confidence that it was the lab that the virus leaked from. So there were things like that. He mentioned, I think, transgenderism as one where they had failed to really ask the hard questions about all that's still not known about that, veering from sort of mainstream orthodoxy. The Hunter Biden laptop, he mentioned that one as well. So I think in this crowd, we intuitively know that about mainstream sources. I think we have to recognize that there are also holes on the conservative side as well. They don't tell you things that you should know. One example of this, just briefly, a quick story, in 2017, I think, 2018 maybe. Anyways, a couple years into the Trump presidency, there was a guy named Dan Coates who was in Congress for many years, and then he became the director of national intelligence under President Trump. And he is a faithful PCA brother of ours. I don't know if you know that. But he actually went to our church up in D.C. at the time. And really nice guy, was there every week. You got a lot to keep up with when you're the director of national intelligence, but every week he showed up, opened the door for his wife, and they had their little security armored vehicle out there. I was in the parking ministry, so I saw this, but it was interesting to watch. But he was faithfully there every week, just a terrific person. And after he left, I ended up interviewing him for World, and he's a godly man. Bottom line is he gets fired, and the circumstances are not really relevant, but he was wrongly fired, and he was replaced. President Trump replaced him with a guy named Richard Grenell. He was the first openly gay cabinet member in U.S. history, who immediately began working to cut intelligence sharing with any country that criminalized homosexuality. Conservative press was absolutely silent on this, and I don't know why. I mean, I'm not going to say there's no story ever written. All I know is the only places I read about it was in the mainstream press. But conservative, press they have their own agenda and reasons and narrative that they want to give you, and so that's why I really encourage people to consume widely, because there is no outlet that has a monopoly on truth. They are different perspectives, and I would argue that we really need a cross section of them to actually understand what's going on. In terms of my actual recommendation on this point, I am a big fan of email newsletters. I think we can. I mentioned last week in response to Reeves' question about, how do we, what do we do? And so I have a job that involves me being involved with Gainesville News, which is kind of odd, but I could explain that to you if you want to know. But so my news consumption of just, in a sense, I'm kind of like you. I consume news about, local, national, state, national, and international events. And my job in Gainesville is kind of separate from that. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not really that different from you, even though I'm in the journalism business. And what I do every morning is I have about 5 email newsletters, and there's many of them out there. I know Reeves this week he said one is I think he reads the New Paper, I think it's called. Which I hadn't heard of, but it was he forwarded it to me, and it's just a quick synopsis of some major events and links to outlets that wrote stories about those. So they're aggregating. There are others at various points. I've had there are ones again. These are from a secular perspective, but the Morning Brew is one. The Daily Skim. And again, if you kind of recognize where they're coming from, then I can just use that filter and take the good, spit out the bad, But the ones I actually consume now would be, I do get World's daily email. It's called The Sift. It's free. And again, they do the sifting for you, So you could just read the headlines, and in about 5 minutes, you can get an idea of what's going on in the world. And I mean, if you did nothing but that, you would be moderately informed, Now, World obviously is coming from its own perspective. They don't, it's not like they don't have blind spots as well. So I do get a few others. The Dispatch, just the free version of the Dispatch daily email roundup. Politico Playbook. This is based in D.C., and so you may not be into D.C. politics that much. That's fine. I used to be there, so I just continued to get it after I left. But if there's a major story going on in the U.S. political world or even internationally, I know I'm not going to miss it. They're gonna tell me, flag it for me, and I may not read the story related to it, but I'm at least going to know what's going on. So that's why I subscribe to that one. And I don't read it every day, but I do sometimes. There's also Political Playbook Florida, which is specific to Florida news. Again, they do work every day. They have a full-time person who rounds up all the headlines from all the outlets in Florida. So I don't have to do that. I can at least know what the mainstream is kind of talking about. And then locally, I get one called, we live in Apopka, and so I get one called the Apopka Voice. Again, if there's something major happening locally, I'll at least know about it. So those are not like, I'm not saying, those are the exact ones you should go do. I'm just saying that's an example. I think in about 15 minutes, you can read some newsletters, survey the headline, do that. And when I'm reading, I just find it lowers the temperature so much. You're not, people's voices are not getting, there's not angst, there's not these horrific photos, pictures necessarily. It helps me to process appropriately the news. So my last recommendation is circling back to where we started, but a different version of it, which is pray for those in the news. I think, and that includes journalists. We all, myself included, we love to complain about the media, but are we actually praying about it? I think that's something we should ask ourselves. When you see something that's bad, whether it's a leader that, maybe you didn't like the funding vote yesterday either. Did you pray about that? I mean, we should be praying for our leaders. That's a basic thing that I think we all know, and yet we often fail to do. But also those we see in the news, whether it's those suffering or whatever. And one more thing, let me just say about the previous point. I think the disproportionate amount of our time often goes to national news, and I think from a Christian perspective, local news is the best way to love your neighbor. So I think we should prioritize local news. I mean, am I the only one who's ever showed up to vote and maybe you're voting for a bigger election or something, president or something, and you get down to those down ballot, and it's like, I have no idea who these people are, Like, I know I'm not the only one who's ever done that. So voting is important, but like these people are local politics it really plays a big part in your lives. The school board, like know who your school board members are and what they believe and vote accordingly. So anyways, but another Karl Barth quote, he said, I always pray for the sick, the poor, journalists, authorities of the state, and the church in that order. Journalists form public opinion. They hold terribly important positions. So I think people in these mainstream positions, we should pray for, pray for some of them to come to Christ who aren't. But I think it's also worth noting that there are major journalists at major outlets that are believers. Just some I'm aware of. John Dickerson is one of the desk people at CBS News. If you've ever seen him, he is a believer. Tom Taylor, somebody we used to go to church with, he helps to run the copy desk, which means he copy edits the pieces that come through at the USA Today. And you might be thinking, well, why doesn't he do more to, fix some of what's wrong at USA Today? But he's told me stories. He absolutely has made a difference on things that were about to go to press. And it's like, actually, he just has that understanding that's different from a lot of his colleagues. People like him need our prayers. He gets very frustrated about some of what he sees, but he's fighting the good fight. Paige Cunningham is someone of influence of the Washington Post. Michael Luau is at the New Yorker. He's, I think, their top editor. And then also just pray that God would raise up more Christian journalists, not just at Christian outlets, but also just in the field. We can't. It's how many Christian journalist applicants did NPR turn down? I think we have to ask ourselves that. They're partly to blame for their echo chamber, but are we feeding them the type of people who might give them other alternatives? Are Christians even applying to work at NPR? I think we've got to ask ourselves that.
They have to survive journalism school first.
Well, they do. Yes, they're.
And then they're turning out, like a lot of university programs, turning out the type of folks who are creating the problem.
Yeah, it depends on where you go. I mean, I went to a public university, and he just said, you got to survive journalism school. I went to a public university, and so, and I did just fine. I mean, what I find is that, I've heard the dean of this, UF has one of the top 10 journalism schools in the country, and I've heard the dean at an event field a question about, the students, and they welcome all types, but again, what are they getting? They are, I've met some, they are there, and they do fine, but there's just not very many of them. And so I think that's something we have to ask ourselves. And then also there are Christian journalism schools. I give you recommendations, but I know one that I've hired a couple people from is Dordt University up in Iowa. There are really good journalism schools in the Christian college community that do have, are training journalists. Dave, did you have something?
Well, it just occurred to me, Justice Scalia was asked one time, known for being such a conservative on the court, why it was he continued to hire his law clerks from Harvard and Yale and non-conservative institutions. And his point, and maybe it applies to journalism school, to Matt's comment, maybe, I'm not sure, but his point was, if you've got somebody who's smart and engaged and is well-grounded and so forth, then 3 years at Harvard Law won't ruin them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that sometimes, but I think about, obviously going through schools and so forth like that is a difficult thing, but I just would wonder if you could see maybe
my experience in 22 years of journalism is, working in secular context, is that it is oftentimes the bias that comes out is not because of, it's not intentional. It's more blind spots. And so that's why I think it's so important for us to engage. We need to be there with a seat at the table. I was talking to I'll say who it was, because this is not being live streamed, but the president of the Tampa Bay Times a few weeks ago, and he acknowledged that they have recently discovered their lack of newsroom diversity. So they are actively starting to look for conservative journalists, not ideological ones. That's the thing. Again, not people who want to make a point in every story and make them into opinion pieces, but conservative journalists who will help them see their blind spots. So again, I think the interest is there, but I think we've got to ask, where's the farm system giving them the options? Okay, we need to wrap up. So just in closing, I just want to say, I hope the last 2 weeks have been informative and that we've talked about some things in terms of nuts and bolts that have been enlightening. But more than that, my goal was just to make you think. So I hope that this has just opened up some new ways of thinking that maybe you can kind of evaluate what you're doing and why, and just keeping that hopefully is worthy of being a North Star, just sort of like, what would it look like for me to use a gospel lens when I'm consuming news? A few weeks ago, I wanted to circle back to something that Pastor Cole said a few weeks ago. He was talking about some of the finer points of Mark, and he says, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so that's my prayer for these 2 weeks, is just that it hopefully has opened your eyes to some things that maybe you weren't aware of before, and that you can see, both what the enemy is trying to do and what maybe God could do through you in terms of choosing a better way. And I thought this was a good verse to end on, which is 1 Corinthians 4:16-18. So we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this wonderful group of people. We thank you for St. Paul's, and I thank you for the opportunity we have to meet and to consider such things in a Sunday school setting. And I pray that you would help us as we go out from here, not just today, but tomorrow and the day after, to always be led by your Spirit and thinking with a gospel lens to the way that we engage with all of culture, with our work, with our families, with all that we're doing. Help us to apply your word to our daily lives, and particularly in this area of news and information. I pray that you would give us great wisdom, help us to have peace, and as we approach a presidential election, I pray that we would just have a complete confidence in you, and know that you, according to Romans 13, you put rulers in office, and so at every level of government, we know that your will be done, and so we pray for that. We thank you that you are sovereign and that you are ruling and reigning over every square inch of your creation. And we pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen.